Yes. So, good morning, students. Let us now resume our discussion on Iranian cinema, which has made a deep impression on everyone, in every part of the world. Films that are immensely popular and which display a fine balance between politics and poetics. As aesthetically pleasing as they are equally powerful politically. So, before we go on to discuss the prescribed movie offside and understand its balance between aesthetics and activism, let us come finish our discussion on Iranian cinema and look at the way in which a new grammar of cinema emerged in Iran, which was in many ways sponsored and supported by the government establishment, but which enabled the very independent filmmakers, the very talented filmmakers to evolve their own language and grammar of films, making Iranian cinema a very unique national cinema. So the attempt on the part of the establishment and these filmmakers was pretty much the same. Make cinema that is meaningful. The establishment, of course, had its own agenda, and it was in many ways against that agenda that these filmmakers were actually working. But that was done in a very subtle and a very artistic way, which is why they were able to survive and contribute to the development of Iranian cinema without, overtly antagonizing the establishment. So I'll go back to the slide where we stopped yesterday. Give me a minute to resume the presentation. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Yeah. So we were talking about the atrocities actually of the Pahlavi dynasty, especially towards the latter part from the 1950s, latter part of the 1950s onwards till throughout the 60s. It is the son, the second member of the dynasty who became the ruler, and during whose reign, there was, with all the liberal measures that he brought in, it was in very rightly identified by some of the anti-establishment leaders of that era as Westoxification. It was toxification under the guise of westernization. They brought in many liberated or liberal changes into Iranian society, but it was in many ways unacceptable to a large section of the Iranian population, particularly the clerics. And that is why it ended up being known as Westoxification. So against these, and then of course, you have the development of Farsi cinema or the Persian cinema, which was a kind of very cheap imitation of foreign films. It is against this kind of trend that you now have the development in the 1970s of the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, Kanun-e Parvaresh e Fakri Kudakan wa No Jawan, that is Kanun for short. It was, a government establishment, and it became a major movement or a major institute that gave a new thrust to Iranian cinema. And you have the major filmmakers like Abbas Kiarostami, who were actually trained or who became very much part and parcel of this Qanun. And on the one hand, you have the government pumping in a lot of resources into this establishment, thinking that it would be able to make films that would give a great deal of propaganda to the new regime, the Islamic regime that came into force in Iran. But as has been rightly pointed out by one of the critics, this Qanun actually became a kind of Trojan horse, because even though it appeared to be a government machinery, you have the likes of Abbas Kiarostami emerging from it, who made some very powerful, subversive works of literature and culture. On the one hand, they are sponsored and distributed by the government, but actually the effect that they achieved was questioning the government in very subtle ways. It was actually, even during the regime of the Pahlavi dynasty, the second ruler, his wife, Faradiba, it was her friend Lili Jahan Ara who was actually the founder of this, and there was therefore a great deal of support from the government, and it started its cinema department in the year 1969, and that is when you have the entry in this institute of people like Kiarostami and the others. Yeah, so you have these filmmakers who now were getting a lot of state sponsorship, but who are also exposed to the best of international films with the kind of film screenings that were taking place in Tehran and other parts of Iran. You have the emergence of a kind of counter cinema against the mainstream commercial Farsi cinema, film Farsi. You have the emergence of a counter cinema, which was in many ways a political cinema that developed its symbolic language due to the long history of censorship imposed by the government. And this was the beginning of the third cinema in Iran. It was very different from the third cinema in other parts of the world, especially Latin America or Africa or many other developing countries, because the socio-political and historical context in Iran was entirely different from that in the other countries. And I'll just make a mention of Abbas Kiarostami, whose, no discussion of Iranian cinema would be complete without a mention of Kiarostami, whose films actually epitomize this Iranian new wave. His vision is very simple and countercultural in a very simple way. He is against, taking a stand against the establishment, but not in a very overtly political, loud language, using the loud language of protest. Unlike the films made by Solanas and Gatineau, for example, here you have very simple narratives, and they are countercultural in a very suggestive and very subtle manner. It's a kind of, his films suggest a kind of alternative culture. But at the same time, it is not as if you have, a clamoring voice being raised to replace the old culture with the new. It is done, on the other hand, in a very suggestive way. We'll just talk briefly about the evolution of the new grammar of cinema. His principal contribution has been his ability to show the inevitability, that is reality and beauty simultaneously. So it is a very realistic representation, but at the same time, it is not, as is seen in many other film industries, a harsh criticism of the political reality. Even in the midst of all the suppression and all the authoritarianism, you have the filmmaker trying to discover beauty. So this coexistence of reality and beauty, that is something unique in Iranian cinema. We begin to see through the camera of filmmakers like Kiarostami, especially through the perspective of children. That is how it becomes a very novel way of looking at the reality. Just a second. I wonder if my connection has been cut. Uh, I guess it's okay. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Yeah, so when children look at the world outside, there is always that element of freshness, novelty, and something very innocent, as we discovered when we discussed the works of Blake, for example. It's not a politically charged kind of vision that children have, but through those innocent uh, eyes of the children in these films, you get to see reality. It's as I told you, therefore, you do not feel that there is protest being offered against the establishment, but in a subtle way, you realize how much the society labors under. So, through the perspective of children, you see the distinction between reality as sheer physicality and reality as it is perceived through the legitimate and the legitimizing epistemics of a culture. And when you watch these films, you really wonder how it was possible for a person like Kiarostami's camera and his film to detach itself from the reality that it thus desediments, and has something to do probably with his uncanny ability to use metaphor and use a new language using a great deal of irony and so on, and a great deal of visual modifications of the narrative. Irony is in fact one of the chief techniques that he uses, and which his successors also use in Iranian cinema to and it's a kind of innocuous, harmless kind of optics. And these techniques, this language, these kind of visuals are in fact the instruments of desedimentation without constituting a metaphysics or even an aesthetics, let alone a culture of their own. So without being overtly political, these films become political in their own suggestive manner. So it is his camera's ethereal ability to remain on the verge of abandoning a culture without entering another. It's not as if a new alternative is suggested, or is proposed, but you get suggestions of such alternatives. I think, as one of the film critics has rightly pointed out, his cinema is a perfect testimony to Theodore Adorno's statement that if artworks are answers to their own questions, they themselves become truly questions. And we need to look only at one of his films to discover the language of his films and the way in which he evolved a new kind of cinema in Iran. This would be the film Kahne Ye Dost Kojas, which means where is my friend's house, or where is the friend's house, a 1987 film. It is part of what is known as the Kokar trilogy made by Kiarostami. Kokar is actually a northeastern village, Iranian village, where the films are set. And you find the stories of these little children who live in these villages, which are far away from the capital, metropolitan, and urban centers like Tehran. And what you have here is a young boy. In the film is all about a homework that has been given by the teacher in this rural school. And there is a boy who keeps getting punished by the teacher because he never submits his assignment on time. He's unable to do that. And on one day, the teacher says that the next time this happens, you will be expelled from the school. And when this little boy, Ahmed, I think is his name, when he reaches home that day, he discovers that his friend's homework is in fact in his bag. The friend who would be expelled by the teacher if he forgot to submit his assignment on time or homework on time the next day. And in a very strange case of mix-up, that boy's homework book ends up in this boy's bag. And he knows that if the next day his friend does not submit the assignment, he would be expelled. So he goes out now in search of his friend's house. They do not know, these friends, these houses do not have a proper address. He does not know where the house is, but he trudges a long distance. And that journey is, the journey through which Kiarostami takes us through the Iranian villages and gives us an insight into life as it is lived there, life as it is under this new regime. So it is the child who meets the people, who asks questions, who sees, how the land suffers. But therefore, when you look at it through the eye of the child, you do not feel that the filmmaker is protesting loudly against the establishment. But whatever needs to be said, whatever the filmmaker wants to convey, gets conveyed. And at the end of this long journey, he never finds his friend's house. It is impossible for him to do that. So therefore, what he comes back home and does is, he does the assignment himself. The next day, the book is submitted, and the teacher feels that the boy has submitted the assignment on time. And what is more, the boy gets complimented for the excellent work, because that is done by this little child. So what you have is, a very beautiful narrative narrated through the story of these two children. And instead of reacting loudly against the authoritarian regime, this film offers a simple antidote, a simple solution against that. What is that? Practice morality and care and love towards and for one another. And that is enough to allow you to, or to enable you to discover beauty even in the midst of this authoritarian regime. And the way out of this kind of authoritarianism is nothing but love and care and concern for each other. How beautifully that powerful message is delivered in a very subtle way. So that is the kind of films made by Kiarostami. Of course, with the 1971-79 Islamic Revolution, you have, powerful waves of change coming in. The whole intention of the new regime was to spread Islamic values among the Iranian population. And as I told you yesterday, to erase all the traces of the Pahlavi dynasty, and including the kind of films that they popularized. So their intention was to wipe off all the traces of Farsi, film Farsi or Persian cinema. And the new filmmakers who were actually educated in these government-sponsored institutions also had the same intention. They too wanted to wipe away the traces of film Farsi, but for a different purpose. What was that purpose? To be able to make films of, films that were to their own liking, films that matched their own aptitude and their own vision and their own fancies. It was not a cheap imitation of foreign films that they wanted to make. They had their own vision, their own artistic vision, and they wanted to tell stories on their own. So it was a classic case of what the government wanted and what these new filmmakers wanted to, being the same. That is, raise a strong protest or voice against the cheap, sentimental, melodramatic Farsi cinema. So the aim of the revolution and successively of the Islamic regime in terms of cultural policy was to create an authentic cultural milieu that would recapture the dignity of Iran as a Muslim country. It was a process of Islamification that was ushered in. And this goal, they believed, had to be achieved through education and the consistent emphasis on Islamic morality. And again, they believed that films would be a powerful medium through which this kind of instruction could be given. Therefore, a new national cinema was promoted by the government, which would respect and promote Islamic values in the new Iranian society. And this intention required erasing the remainders of the Pahlavi regime. And now you have many film theaters which were destroyed, shut down. All those film theaters which had Western names, Western, and which constantly showed Western movies were all shut down or burnt or destroyed. And even the ones that survived soon changed their Western names and adopted Islamic or third world names. And it is in this new era, after the new wave, Iranian new wave ushered in by people like Kiarostami, you have a post-revolutionary new Iranian cinema. After the 1979 revolution and the establishment of the Iranian Islamic Republic, new guidelines were established. You now have the system of modesty being brought in as a strict code of conduct. And very strangely or paradoxically, you can say, these censorship guidelines actually forced Iranian filmmakers to develop a new filmic grammar, which is a kind of constant negotiation with state censors. They do not take them head on, or it is not a head on collision with censorship, but they negotiate their way through all that, contributing to a new visual and oral film form that is distinctive to Iranian cinema. So the Farabi cinema, Farabi is an Arab word, or which means the gift of God or gift of Allah. And the Farabi Cinema Foundation that was instituted by the new government actually thus aided the Iranian new wave cinema in exactly the same way that the Qanun of the earlier, of the 1970s aided the emergence of Iranian cinema, or the new kind of cinema of Kiarostami. You have more and more waves of novelty being ushered in by the Farabi cinema. So the intellectual filmmakers, therefore, and their adversaries, the Islamic ideologues, both of them shared the same attitude of hatred towards film Farsi. So ultimately, they both ended up making films which opposed film Farsi. So the Farabi Film Cinema Foundation was highly influential, especially, we need to remember the name of a government official named Muhammad Beheshti. Under his leadership, this institute or the Film Foundation played a major role in the promotion and distribution of Iranian cinema domestically and worldwide. So they gave free, licenses to these filmmakers to send their films for film festivals in other parts of the world, and that is how the rest of the world actually began to discover Iranian cinema. Yeah, so the names of some of the major filmmakers who came up during the 1980s and 1990s, aided by the government sponsorship and support. Mehruji, Amir Naderi, Bahman Farmanara, Mohsen Makbalbaf, Samira Makbalbaf, his daughter, and then Behram Baizai. Of course, Kiarostami continued to make films even during this era. He was, of course, the one who initiated the new wave, and he continued to be a major player in new Iranian cinema too. The post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. The new wave was pre-revolutionary. It was towards the end of the Pahlavi regime that began. In the post-revolutionary phase, also Kiarostami continued to make films, and by then he had become a global sensation, and because of the global attention that he got, the rest of the movies that came from Iran also were received with great deal of enthusiasm by the rest of the world. Yeah, so all these filmmakers seeing the beauty and life in the midst of the unbearable inevitability of being. One critic has called Kiarostami as the first visual poet of his nation. So important as Kiarostami is, we cannot afford to linger too long on Kiarostami's kind of films. I'll just mention 3 other filmmakers and then move on to Jafar Panahi. We cannot, exactly like Kiarostami's films, you have the films of Behram Beiza. He has again, made very powerful films and written a great deal about cinema also. He's worked towards a new revelation of the universe in which the Iranians as colonials, as those written out of the history of their own modernity, can be reborn. So writing new stories to enable or to ensure the rebirth of Iran. That is what Berzai did, the reconstitution of the real in a cinematic way. To achieve the reconstitution of the real in a cinematic way, visuality becomes the central mechanism of his films, and he actually embarks on a mission to teach his audiences to see, see anew, see in a proper way. So for grounding the visual possibility of color and shape as the constituent forces of the narrative results in their active stylization, the kind of camera angles, the visual language that he popularized, it was a new kind of visual imagery that he popularized. So you have the constitution of a new visual world, which legitimately is operative on its own terms and is aesthetically irreducible, giving palpable reality to film as the visual substitution of the real, from which we can reconstitute the real by contesting it. So making the use of the medium of films to tell new stories, without, of course, in doing it in a very antagonistic way. Then you have the other major filmmaker, Mohsen Makhmalbaf, who celebrates the nomadic life of the gypsies, the Iranian, there are certain tribes like the Bedouin tribes, for example. They are nomadic. They do not have a settled life. And the life of the nomad is celebrated. That is one way in which the filmmaker actually critiques the rigid establishmentarianism or the rigid establishment. The life, free, unhampered life of the nomad is kind of projected as something that offsets the rigidity, the stability, and the static nature of the establishment. So you get to see the landscape of rural Iran and the free life of the nomads. And I think one of his quotations is worth reading out in this context. My hope is that the viewer of my work, at least for an hour and a half, will, at least to a small extent, breathe in an air which is somewhat different from that in which they live. So offering the film as a kind of escape from their reality. If successful, this will be no more than a very small, almost insignificant achievement, but that is an achievement. He says that he doesn't think that he's a very significant person who can bring about change, but I must at least try to do something. The significance of what I do is not very important to me. Its nature, its quality is what is important to me. We filmmakers are here only to illuminate, to bring joy to life. All I seek is that after seeing a film of mine, a person feels a little happier and acts with a little more kindness towards the world. This kind of vision of reacting to the real, not in violent terms of protest, but probably ignoring it, probably looking at it through the angle of irony, looking at it through the angle of children and so on. These offer fresh perspectives. It's a new kind of protest against the establishment that emerges. And trained under him, his daughter Samira Makhmalbaf also, emerges as a major voice in Iran. You would think that a country that has really repressed women in the name of Islamification has also engendered the talent of people like Samira Makhmalbaf. She's not, of course, an isolated figure among the many filmmakers. There are many other women filmmakers, but of course she's the most famous. Trained by her own father when Mohsen Makhmalbaf was 17 years old, he drew a knife to stab a policeman in order to launch a revolution to liberate his country. But when his daughter Samira was 17 years old, She borrowed her father's camera and shot a film to record the liberation of two young girls from their father's prison house. So using the camera as a weapon. These are the words of a famous critic about the work of Samira Moghbalbaf. While her father ended in jail, she succeeded in recording an emancipation and showed it to the world. She went on to make other films, anticipating a new kind of film. Her father may have taught how to make his daughter how to make films, but she has taught her father how to liberate a nation. So this is Hamid Dabashi, a major film critic about new Iranian cinema. What is taking place in the best of Iranian cinema is precisely that. It is not timely. When something is offered as a strong voice of protest, it becomes very timely in the sense that it becomes very relevant. It is so topical that sometimes after that particular point of time, it might lose its relevance. It would not be considered a classic at all, especially if it is very topical and connected too closely to the time. I hope you remember Elaine Showalter's discussion of the feminist novelist, the feminist, female, that of those three stages. She talks about the feminist novelists. There were people who were very talented, they had enough potential, but unfortunately, they were too caught up in the rhetoric. They were too caught up in the argument. They were too caught up in the protest movements, as a result of which fine art did not emerge from them. There was a great deal of rhetoric, there was a great deal of politics, but not enough art. And that is precisely what is absent in Iranian cinema. It is not as if it is too topical that it becomes too overtly political and therefore loses out on its artistic quality. No, on the other hand, these films have that timeless, universal quality in them. By not being timely, these films have been far more relevant. Iranian cinema at its best is like the Copernican heliocentrism that has surpassed the geocentrism of Iranian politics. Moving from a geocentric worldview to a heliocentric worldview. The geocentric worldview is one which places the earth as the center. It's a very limited kind of perspective. Whereas once you move to the Copernican era, you see the sun as the center and the earth as nothing but one among the many planets that revolve around the sun. So, exactly like that, you have the earth, the Iranian politics is very much there. But instead of being overtly or overly conscious about it and overly taking up issues against it and protesting against it, they adopt a larger vision. They see the universe through a wider angle. And that is how it is almost like a transition from geocentrism to the wider heliocentrism. Helio, of course, is the sun. The problem is not that the best of Iranian filmmakers cannot see what is in front of them. It's not as if they're turning a blind eye and they are being apolitical. Not at all. They are political, but in a very subtle way. And it is not as if they're pursuing things that are irrelevant to their reality. On the contrary, it is the Iranian public intellectuals, the reformers, who actually cannot see what is in front of them when they're faced with the film of a Kiarostami or a Moghbalbaf, and they are busy digging their own narrative grave. That is, they do not have the artistic vision to be able to appreciate the film of a Kiarostami or a Moghbalbaf and try to find out what these films are actually trying to convey. So in the case of Iranian cinema, the presence of visuality is constitutional to the deconditioning of the real, so that it can expose itself as no longer predicated on a basis, a ground, a frame of reference, or a debilitating memory. In other words, it is not too limited. By framing the real, the visual act deframes the real from all its conditional perceptions, receptions, and registers. It is not a limited worldview that responds to these films. To put art, the visual and performing arts in particular, consciously at the service of social and political causes, ultimately and paradoxically ossifies and thus intensifies precisely those forces that have conditioned those causes. When you become too political, actually what happens is that you make that against which you are protesting also more powerful. They become very vigilant. They know what you are trying to convey through your films, and they actually become much more powerful. That kind of ossified, very, very static system. This truth is something that these Iranian filmmakers have really awoken to. A far more radical and effective negation of those forces is to abandon the site of their authority, remove yourself from there, turn your gaze elsewhere, and through that to point out the fault of the system in a very subtle way. To abandon the site of their authority, on which the most politically subversive is mutated into its instrumental logic. That is why Kiarostami remains the most political of all Iranian filmmakers, even though he has never spoken in a very loud manner and taken a harsh political stance on anything. They are not apolitical, but they are political in a very subtle way. And this continues in the 21st century too. There is a subtle but visible shift away from the formal and narrative strategies of the new Iranian cinema. And it's in a period, or it's in a state of being constantly evolving. And probably you will find newer versions of new wave or new kind of cinema. It is too early to say what direction new Iranian films will take in the 21st century, but there is no denying the fact that there are filmmakers like the one that we have to discuss, Jafar Panahi, who are very much there in the forefront and who keep evolving new languages for filmmakers. So these new filmmakers show that in contrast to their government and its backward policies, they are extremely well acquainted with the rules of modern cinema, and they give us beautiful images of a demonized Iran that they force viewers to doubt the image of the country in the general media. So they give us insights into Iran, which are very different from the stereotyped images of Iran that the Western media likes to perpetrate. So finally, I think to sum up whatever we have discussed so far, we can say that the history of cinema in Iran can be divided basically into 4 periods. The first one, with the adoption of the constitution and Iran becoming a monarchy with its own constitution, a democratic monarchy. That is the Pahlavi period from 1900 to 1941, the arrival of cinema with the Shah being so fascinated by the visual medium, and he wanted the people of Iran also to get a taste of cinema. And you have the opening of new theaters, new films being made, and so on. Then when the Shah's son comes in, that is when you have the second Pahlavi era, which is when you have large-scale liberalization and the import of Western and films from other countries, as a result of which film Farsi develops. And in opposition to that, during the third era, the post-revolutionary era, with the Islamization of Iranian cinema from 1980 to 1988, the new crop of filmmakers working with the government support, but actually, on the one hand, opposing film Farsi, and in a very subtle way, also opposing the government machinery. And that has continued from the 1990s in the 2000s, and you have the new Iranian cinema characterized by the works of some of the filmmakers whom we have seen, and who Jafar Panahi, whose work we will discuss. Again, when we discuss Iranian cinema, I think we must also make a mention of Hamid Nafisi, a major critic, a film historian who has written some of the most valuable books on Iranian cinema, voluminous too. He has written the history of Iranian cinema in 4 volumes, and this is something that has got a great deal of popularity. He calls the first, the volume 1 deals with the early era, the artisanal era. Volume 2, the industrializing years, that is from 1941 to 1978, the westernization, the period of westernization. The third era is that of the Islamicate period, 1978 to 1984, and from then on, it is the globalizing era. I think this is a very, what shall you say? In a capsule, you'll get to see how Iranian cinema has evolved over the years. I have just put here the words of another critic who has looked at Iranian cinema mainly through 3 phases. Till the 1940s, a particular feature or a particular phase for Iranian cinema. You can read it yourself. The second phase, the phase of westernization, 1950s and 60s. And the third phase, what the government calls Islamification, but what emerges through the camera is a different kind of new wave cinema in Iran. You can read about that. And it is in this phase that you have the work of Jafar Panahi, born in 1960, a person who was apprenticed to Kiarostami. He too attended the Qanun, where he came directly under the guidance of Kiarostami, and began here, even though he began from a very young age, at the age of 10 or 12, actually, his engagement with cinema began. And he's today a very important part of the Iranian new wave film movement. He began his career by making short movies, but soon became an assistant director to Abbas Kiarostami, and that is where he actually perfected his craft. And he hit the news headlines when he made the first feature film in 1995, The White Balloon, and that walked away with the all-important award at the Cannes Film Festival. And this was the first major award that an Iranian film won at Cannes. He is, of course, these are the major films that he has made: The White Balloon, The Mirror, The Circle, Crimson Gold, Offside, the movie that we have to discuss. And he's always got into trouble with the establishment because, unlike Kiarostami, he's always made his political stand very clear. When he makes his films, of course, you have very beautiful filmic language that he adopts, but otherwise, he writes, he speaks against the establishment, and very often he has found himself in jail. He's been imprisoned on many occasions, and each time the way he comes out of that imprisonment with a new film, that is definitely worth discussing. In the year 2011, for example, when he was banned from making films with I think a digital camera, he made a film called This Is Not a Film, and copying it into a pen drive. I think the film was, even while he was banned from making films, he made this film, and he gave it the title, This Is Not a Film. I think it was put into a flash drive, put inside a cake, and the cake was sent out of the country. And that is how it was, I think, screened in some of the major film festivals, and it walked away with many awards. He made Parda, Taxi, and then Three Phases. One finds him appearing in many of his films and adopting a lot of postmodern techniques, like in exactly the way we would say that in postmodern fiction, you would have the writer appearing and then constantly reminding us about the self-consciousness of that work or the created nature of that work. In his films, again, sometimes he comes in, sometimes you have the central character talking to the audience and says, I've had enough of this, and so on. Constantly drawing attention to the film as a made thing. So his films realistically depict humanity and the struggles of humanity in Iran, particularly the struggles of children and women. On the other hand, outside the films, he comments very loudly and audaciously on political and social issues. He keeps challenging the authorities, and therefore, unlike Kiarostami and Maqbal Buff, especially unlike Kiarostami, he has emerged as one of the most suppressed filmmakers in Iran. Yet, he continues to make films that artistically emerge as, changes limitations into art. These are some of the films which I have put up in the previous slide, the names of which I've put up in the previous slide. In films like Taxi, for example, he appears in it as a character. He's a taxi driver, and in the conversations that he has with the passengers, you have some of his very powerful expressions on or opinions on cinema being expressed. In Three Phases, for example, he and an actress, they travel in search of a person to be cast in a movie that they are planning. And the girl whom they are trying to, to cast in their movie is somebody who is unable to act because of the fierce restrictions that are imposed on women against their acting in society. In The White Balloon, in The Mirror, and so on, you have children again, as it appears in Kiarostami's and Maqbal Buff's films, the reality being explored through the vision of children. This is, of course, that Qanun, the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, where Abbas Kiarostami was a key figure and where Jafar Panahi was also trained. You can see how well established this institute is. It was part of the government machinery, and the government, had put in a lot of money into this center in order to get the films of their liking made. So his films are known for their humanistic perspective on life in Iran, often focusing on the hardships of children and the impoverished women. The White Balloon, the first film that he made, is about a young girl who wants to buy a goldfish. That is her dream. The dreams and the aspirations of children, of women in Iran. But the harsh reality comes in the way of her money getting, it falls down into a drain. The system takes it away. And the way in which individual aspirations are curtailed by the system in this country. That is what it metaphorically suggests. The Mirror is the second movie in which a young girl decides to make her own way home after her mother forgets to pick her up at the end of the day of the school. But she, the little girl does not know her address. And this is the film where you have Jafar Panahi entering the postmodern techniques. The actress who plays the main character suddenly announces that she's tired of playing the role of the little girl and that she wants to go home. With the third film, The Circle, Panahi becomes overtly political. It is about two women in contemporary Iran, and they are convicts. When they escape from the prison, you realize, the movie makes us realize how they're actually escaping into a bigger prison. That is what life in Iran is. They are in no way better off than they were in the real jail. Then you have a major film of his called Crimson Gold. It is not so much about women, it's about a robbery at a jewelry store. And then you follow the story of the robber, then a poor pizza delivery man. And then it is during this journey that you encounter the injustices that are perpetrated by the government, the iniquities that prevail in the society. I'll just make a mention of, some of the very political controversies that he has often found himself embroiled in. He sometimes backed the opposition candidate in elections, and then he would speak for the Green Movement. He was very actively a participant in the Green Movement protest, which is, of course, an anti-government protest. And during these, occasions, he was often arrested. Then he would be released later. And while making a movie that was set during the Green Movement protest, he was again arrested in March 2010. He was banned from filmmaking, but he applied for an appeal, or he sought for an appeal. And it is during that time that he made films like This Is Not a Film, which depicts a day in his own life when he awaits the result of his appeal, which was it was very secretly made in his apartment and was smuggled out of Iran in a flash or a pen drive hidden inside a cake. Then he made A Closed Curtain. From the title itself, you know how it is a very powerful political film, where you have the screenwriter who collaborated with him, who goes into seclusion at his seaside home, but his solitude is disturbed by a young woman fleeing the police. So, like the other movie, The Mirror, the story is broken by real life when Panahi himself appears as himself, and the characters try to get him to finish their story. 6 characters in search of an author kind of situation. And he secretly made the film at his seaside home with a very small crew. Oh, there were 2 pictures that went along with these in the film Taxi. Again, as I told you, he, as a taxi driver, has conversations with his passengers on films, on the challenges of making films, on especially in a conversation with his niece, one of the passengers, about how to make a short film for the school. And the latest movie that he made in 2018, he in 3 phases. That is where he goes on a road trip with the actress Behnaz Jafari in search of a young girl whose family bars her from pursuing an acting career. I think I'll stop there for the day, and in the next class on Monday, we'll take a look at the film that I did not mention in this in these 3 slides, and that is the film Offside, the film that he made in the year 2006, based on the real event of Iran playing a qualifying football match with Bahrain, and the problems faced by young girls who are football enthusiasts but who were prevented from watching the match live in the Azadi Stadium in Tehran. Okay, so that will be on Monday. Okay, I'll stop now.
Thank you, ma'am.